This is episode number 9 with Alvin Huang. Welcome to the Archiologist Talks. The Archiologist is a collaborative platform that focuses on showcasing worldwide design projects from students and young professionals. This time around, though, we're creating a space to talk about design with the leading architects and designers around the world. Our goal for these conversations is to inspire and influence the young community. We're going to bring in tips, personal insights, and different perspectives of what design really is to each one of us. And I'm your host, Maria Flores. Hey guys, how's it going? This is episode number 9. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so excited to finally be back. I was just in a 2-week trip to Peru. It was honestly one of the best trips that I've ever had in my whole life. It was so fun. The country is amazing. The food, spectacular. All the places that I went to, it was just magical. Seriously. Lima is so modern. It has beautiful beaches, beautiful views, and Cusco and all the other places that I went in the mountains. It was just so amazing to learn all that stuff for the ancient Incas and stuff like that. It was just great. And if you've never been, you should definitely go. And no, this is not sponsored by the Peru government or the country of Peru in any way. I just had an amazing time and I wanted all of you to know about it. So today in the podcast, we have Alvin Huang. He is an award-winning architect and designer. He is also an educator who specializes in the integrated application of material performance, emergent design technologies, and digital fabrication. He is the founder and the design principal of Synthesis Design and Architecture, which is basically Synthesis DNA. And he's also an associate professor at USC School of Architecture in Los Angeles. His work spans through all scales. It basically ranges from high-rise towers and mixed-use developments to temporary pavilions and furnishings, so it's really cool. We start off the conversation by asking him about this text that he wrote not too long ago, where he refers to technology as techne, right? This new term for development in technology and advancements in technology, and how we can use, as designers, obviously, how we can use technology in a very different way with our intuition instead of just, designing for aesthetic sakes. He believes that we should stop seeing technology as a solution, and we should instead consider to see technology as a provocation, so basically as a means. We also talk about something that he's been working on for a very long time, which is pattern, and how pattern can actually communicate architectural ideas to the people, and how his office works with pattern. We also talk about a very important term that's been going around for quite a long time, parametricism, and how computational design nowadays is being used or mostly exploited because of its novelty. And this is where he comes from, saying that we should work intuitively with the computer to be successful designers, to be knowledgeable, and to anticipate what the computer is going to do. So I cannot wait for you guys to listen to this episode. It's a very cool episode where we talk about technology mostly. So I'm very eager for you guys to listen to it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, on Instagram, wherever you want. Have fun and let the talk begin. Hey Alvin.
Hey Maria, how's it going?
Good. How's everything going in LA?
It's good. Beautiful weather is normal and enjoying
As
it.
usual.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about yourself. What do you do? Your work?
Okay, so I am an architect. I have a small firm called Synthesis Design and Architecture. I'm also a associate professor at the USC School of Architecture, where I teach design studios as well as produce design research and focused on the sort of intersection of design, technology, and fabrication.
I would like to start off asking you a little bit about the text that you sent me. I'm gonna share it with everyone, of course, But I want to know, there was a quote that you put, which I found really interesting, which was technology is the answer. But what was the question? What do you mean by that?
So that quote comes from Cedric Price,
Mm-hmm.
super important architect from the 60s, in a talk he gave in 1966 by that same title, Technology is the Answer, but what was the question? And for me, that was a little bit of a kind of response to some of the things that I've been watching occur in academia, in the realm of computation, in the realm of technology and its applications in design, where within the academic setting, say design research or computational research tends to focus a lot on technological problems and technological answers to technological problems. And I think I'm really interested in kind of reframing that as something that is about architectural problems or design problems that technology can help answer, but the question is coming from us rather than coming from the technology. So it's rather than trying to push the technology, it's actually trying to leverage the technology.
To what extent do you believe that technology has always been in our lives? Is this a new phenomenon, or has it always been there, even from the times of Le Corbusier?
It's always been there. I mean, I think if you really identify what a technology is, it's something that helps you do something, right? And so a pencil is a technology. There was a pre-pencil period, there was a post-pencil period. And things that you were able to do after the invention of the pencil are very different than what you were able to do before the pencil. But more importantly, how you think was enabled by the appearance of certain technologies. And so some technologies are hardware, others are software. And at the time of, say, Corbusier, there are sort of parallel ideas of both hardware and software that are happening. On the hardware side, Corb is looking at things that were sparked by the Industrial Revolution and mass production of steel and concrete and glass to enable his designs, but at the same time, he's taking a software approach by examining how things like airplanes are machines for flying and carrying people and working in particular ways that are machine-like. And he takes those sorts of ideas and carries them over to architecture and says that a machine is a house for living, and begins to examine the kind of functions of the house as a machine-like process that the house has to enable.
Right. When in your text you talk about this word that is techne, right? Am I saying it correctly?
I believe so. Yeah. I mean, it comes from ancient Greek, and I don't speak ancient Greek, so I'm going by the same pronunciation you are.
But what does it mean exactly? Like I read a little bit of that it was the knowledge of actually doing the work, but then using technology in order to do the work.
Right, and so the term actually comes from Aristotle in a book he wrote called the Nicomachean Ethics. And in this book, he talks about craft and the evolution of crafts. And in ancient Greek, the term for craft was actually techne, but it did not mean the same thing that we understand craft to mean. Like in modern day language, craft is sort of associated with the handmade and the kind of let's say skill or ability to work with your hands, or the ability to work with care on something. In the Nicomachean Ethics and in the ancient Greeks, they basically position all forms of thinking and doing as techne. So doctors have a techne, architects have a techne, artists, masons, carpenters, etc. Anybody that is doing something and producing something that has to involve a level of skill, a level of expertise, and a level of thinking that is enabled by those skills and those techniques. And so the way I position it is that techne is the elevation of what I would say tool to technique, to techne.
Mm-hmm.
And so the sort of parallel I give in some recent talks I've been giving is let's say, taking a parallel from music, where we can identify a saxophone as a tool. A saxophone would be something that would produce sounds and make noises that the human could not make without the instrument. The technique is the sheet music and the sort of ability to replicate certain sounds and understand them in sequence to produce them and create the same results, from one person to the next.
Yes.
But the techne might be thought of more as, like, say, the elevation of tool and technique to an art form, where, say, Miles Davis or John Coltrane, their ability to improvise or produce music that is not pre-written and not pre-composed is a way of thinking and a way of expression that comes about from a mastery of tool and technique.
Okay, I see. So what is your take on the revolution that has been happening, as you were saying in the beginning, that since you're a professor, you've been seeing a lot of computerized softwares being used, but however, sometimes not to the level of intuitive approach. People are basically just letting the software do the work for them, and therefore not really using the techniques that you're talking about. Do you think this is, like, what's your take on all of this?
I would not at all say that it's people letting the software do the work for them, but I would say that, and some of it is understandable. At the level of students, you are being exposed to a new set of tools, a new set of techniques, and then you just try to apply them, and you try to almost find justifications or reasons to use them. I think the distinction I would make is when you're really trying to think with them, so that, some of that comes from having a broad enough depth and a broad enough knowledge that you can kind of understand core concepts as opposed to just end results, and trying to I think essentially what it comes down to is what architects are best at, which I think the thing that architects are best at doing is lateral thinking and lateral problem solving, and trying to understand why a problem exists, but not what the problem is, but what the cause of the problem is, or how the problem is the result of another series of underlying problems that can be investigated, that can be interrogated, and can be kind of repackaged into a different problem. And I think that's where I think this switch of technique to techne, like technique is more kind of applying things you already know what the end result will be and then perfecting them. Techne would be trying to understand their core concepts and trying to make parallels to how those concepts can be applied in different ways to solve different problems.
Which Lateral Thinking is also a book. You guys should read it.
I'll have to check that out.
For architects.
Who's it by?
Oh, I have no idea. But the name is Lateral Thinking for architects and creatives.
Yeah. But I do think that that's probably the key thing that I think is really important. I think that us as designers and architects, like, one of my mentors is Hanif Kara from Adams Kara Taylor. He's a great structural engineer, also teaches at the GSD. And I was on a panel discussion with him once where somebody asked him what the difference was between a great architect and a great engineer. He said, great engineers come up with great solutions. And he kind of jokingly nudged me, and he's like, great architects create great problems. And I actually find that to be a really, really compelling argument, in the sense that we aren't necessarily trying to just come up with a technical solution. We're trying to come up with the reason the problem exists in the first place, and trying to say, and one of the things I talk about a lot with clients and with students, I guess, with clients, it's more that they give me a brief of what they're looking for and a project and what the goals and objectives are of it. Oftentimes those objectives have a lot to do with pragmatics and kind of functional requirements and things like that. And my job before I design is actually to assess that and try to find the underlying problem within that, where that makes for a more interesting solution. And I think that's the same thing I advise my students on, is that when I give them a brief, it's kind of written in a more generic, general term. And then their job is to find their problem inside my brief. Like, what's the question that they're trying to solve? And I think that's something that I apply both in practice and in pedagogy.
How do you believe that architectural softwares and computational design can actually solve problems of today's world?
I don't think they can. I mean, to be okay. I guess it's a matter of semantics. I don't think it's the software that solves them. It's the people that leverage the software that solve them. And I think it's the ability of computation and software advances that allows us to leverage their capabilities to augment our own thinking ability. And some of those things are, let's say with parametric modeling, the ability to kind of connect multiple relationships geometrically and understand the results of the knock-on effects of, let's say, tweaking one geometry to understand how another geometry responds, to see how another geometry responds, etc., etc. And this kind of string of things that produces that, or that kind of multiplies, that exponentially produces a sort of generative effect. And those are moments where we can discover, curate, and kind of fine-tune and finesse things towards our own sort of design visions. But I think the ability is not that the software is doing the solving.
Right.
The saxophone didn't do it. It was still Coltrane.
Yeah. And it's also one of the points that you raise in the text, the making of pattern, for example. How that's very important to take that ability of computational design and a good architect, obviously a good designer, and solve the idea of communicating through the architectural device. How do you work with pattern in synthesis, DNA?
Well, pattern's something I've been obsessed with for a really long time in architecture, and I think one of the things that gets lost on students is this idea of articulation, particularly like in your kind of fundamental beginnings, where everything's really more about massing and scale and proportion and gesture. But then you start to understand as you develop, and that particularly when you enter the working world, there's really nothing that's made out of foam core, foam, or Strathmore, right? Like everything there's no such thing as a continuous solid surface. Right? Like everything has a pattern, whether it's joints or panels or rivets, whatever it is. There's always going to be some sort of articulation on the surface. And that becomes something that, for, let's say, modernism, has been an effective tool for conveying the grid and expressing the kind of organizational structure. And I think in the way I like to use it has a lot more to do with kind of directionality and where the eye goes and where the eye travels, and the ability of the pattern to be expressive rather than, like, let's say, locally variable rather than globally uniform. And let's say patterns that can be adaptive to localized conditions. And maybe a parallel would be the distinction between, let's say, the grid of New York, which is is a Cartesian grid that is dropped from above and superimposed onto the island and does not respect any of the topographic or edge conditions. It just cuts off. Sorry, there's a little bit of background noise here in downtown LA. Okay. So but
it's always crazy.
Yeah, and versus, let's say, the skin of a snake, right? Where the skin of a snake, if you look closely, the kind of pattern of the snake skin is adjusting to the very particular areas where the snake bends and moves, and the pattern gets tighter so that it can actually have more flexibility and more movement in certain areas, and then other areas where it doesn't need to move, it's a more regular, more uniform grid or cellular structure. And so in this case, the pattern is revolved around performance in terms of the way that the snake performs, but also becomes a way of articulating that performance into something that is expressive and does not kind of totalize the snake as one condition.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. Do you think then that aesthetics, as just building an architecture that is just based on aesthetics, is basically a waste of time without really thinking about the performance and how it communicates?
Absolutely. I mean, I think building anything off of one factor, whether it's aesthetics or economy or performance or anything, like if it's just about one thing, then I don't think it's architecture. And I think that's kind of like a big thing that I talk about a lot with students is, like, let's say the difference between architecture with a capital A and building with a lowercase b, where, it's statistically proven, I think 85% of this planet, in terms of our built environment, was not designed by architects. You come from Venezuela, it's probably even higher in places like that, where outside of Caracas, the favelas and all of those conditions are, and this is the kind of, let's say, informal settlements around the world, but in the rest of the developed world, it still exists, and we don't truly understand it, but like much of this planet is constructed by contractors and engineers, and architects are at play in a very, very small category. And then within that category, it might get even smaller as to what we would call architecture with a capital A. But let's just focus on let's say that stuff that is built by architects. The stuff that is not architecture with a capital A still needs to meet code, still needs to have structural requirements, still needs to be waterproof, still needs to do all the functional, pragmatic things that a properly built building needs to have. But what they're missing versus the ones that I would identify as architecture is participation in a conversation about disciplinary concerns. And those disciplinary concerns are, let's say, a larger conversation about where that project sits relative to other projects, either in history or at the current moment, and takes a position as to whether they are following certain things or rejecting certain things or participating in something else. And so if that's the case, then we can actually say, like, building codes and structural requirements and the pragmatics of the functions of the building are important, but they're not what makes the building architecture.
Yeah.
Right. And what makes the building architecture is not exclusive to one domain, and that's why I keep it fairly broad as a definition of kind of disciplinary participation. I don't even want to identify it as disciplinary relevance, but just the fact that let's say if you look at what makes Duchamp's toilet art is its disciplinary participation, right? Not its toiletness. Right? Like the removal of the toilet from the bathroom and the placement of it in a gallery is a conscious act by the author and by the artist for it to say something, and that dialogue is something he wants to have. And so the dialogue that, let's say, an architect or a designer wants people to have with the building, beyond its functions and beyond its sort of, pragmatics, whether it's what it communicates or how it performs or what it expresses or what styles it adheres to, whatever the case may be. I think those are the things that elevate architecture.
Yeah. In your studio, I know you talked a little bit about this, but how do you use the computer to aid your designs?
You're referring to my design studio, or
Yes.
as in synthesis?
Oh, well,
or
synthesis. Yeah.
Okay. So in my practice, I mean, I would say that it's still evolving. Let's say in the original version of the office, it really was maybe a fascination with the technology and an emphasis on this idea of form follows performance. And so thinking about the maxim from Louis Sullivan about form ever follows function. What we're talking about is expanding the definition of function, where if function is more than utility, right? So utility, going back to the kind of pragmatics that I was talking about before, then I actually think we're engineers, because engineers are all about kind of efficiency, economy, performance. Those three things. Like how to do the strongest thing with the least amount of material, and that's it.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what it looks like. Doesn't matter what it says. Doesn't matter, because what it says is really about it doing it the most effectively and most efficiently.
Exactly.
But if you include performance as something that has to do with, let's say, structural performance, as well as environmental performance, as well as optical performance, as well as programmatic performance, and how well all of those things stitch together, that would be where I would say computation kind of first infected me in terms of thinking about the studio and how I would leverage it for design work. And I think more recently, and some of this comes across in that text, beginning to think about it more as a way of aiding in the rethinking of how we can kind of challenge convention. And that in challenging convention, like, it's something where I guess, and I'm guilty of this as well as the students that I might be critiquing on this. I think one of my big problems with computational processes and in design or in architecture is their ability to be replicated, and the ability for, like, let's say the Voronoi pattern has become such a overused, overwrought, sort of cliche kind of condition of the digital paradigm. And I think that that's something where those reference points become destination points, where students are working towards them rather than working from them.
Yeah.
And I think similar things happen in all sorts of genres of architectural design or style, where students oftentimes may start off the project by saying, I want to do something modernist or postmodern or digital or whatever it is. And then they're set off on a direction that is about reaching a target rather than taking the inspiration as a departure point.
Yeah.
And so I think what I'm really, really interested in is leveraging computation to kind of try to discover opportunities for social, cultural, and kind of social, cultural expression and positioning that can be enabled by the technology. That, and further, I would also kind of add that the term's been thrown around quite a lot lately, but this idea of the post-digital, and I think other people are using it in a fairly different way, as the digital is over and now we're doing something else.
And what comes after that?
I don't know. I mean, I use it in a very different way in terms of saying, I think post-digital means that it's not that the digital is over, it's that the digital is a given. So we don't have to preface we don't have to preface what we're doing with the fact that it is digital. I graduated from my undergraduate degree in 1998, and at that time, the conversation that was being had amongst me and my classmates was, are you going to go to an office or a CAD office? And that distinction between normal office and CAD office was something that we would, point out. And now it's this kind of stupid thing to say. There's no such thing as a non-CAD office. There might be a few, just like there's really no workspace that you can go to. Like you can go to and say, do you guys use computers or not? And when the car was first introduced 100-something years ago, it was called a horseless carriage because it came after the horse. And now, 100-something years later, nobody cares or remembers that there was ever a horse involved. And I think the same thing is going to happen with autonomous vehicles. People refer to them as driverless cars. But once they don't have a driver, they don't have to be the same car anymore. They don't have to be designed like you have a steering wheel. They don't have to be designed like you face the front. They don't have to have a driver and a passenger. They don't have to have a front and a back. Whichever way the car goes is the right way it's going.
Yeah.
And so I think now we're in an era where the digital is a given, but what you do with it is what's important.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a very interesting way of looking at the post-digital, how you're saying. I do believe that it's going to be something related to that. I have a final question for you. And what's a piece of advice that you would give an architecture student right now? Or a graduate, let's say?
Be hungry, be engaged, be curious. And I think that applies to the way that students deal with their studies. I think it has to do with the way they view the world, and it has to do with the way that they try to ask questions about everything. I think the best thing an architect can do to make themselves a good architect is to travel. And I do realize that is a position of privilege, to be able to require somebody to travel. Like traveling is a privilege. But you can't really be a good architect if you don't understand the way people work, think, and live. And you can't do that if you've only seen people work, think, and live from one position. And the more you travel, the more you understand the way things work in other places, the way that people think in other places, which allows you to truly understand the way people work and think where you're from. If you spend a lot of time in one space, you don't really understand what that space looks like or feels like until you step out of it and see other spaces. And then when you come back to it, you can understand it in a different way.
What are the top places that you've been to?
My 3 favorite cities in the world are Bangkok, London, and Mexico City. Those are my top 3. I'm a big city guy. Like, I love my beaches and remote island getaways, but those are escapes. But I like just the sort of combination of, let's say, density, history, modernism, and culture that exists in those 3 locations. I really, really, really love those 3 cities.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. It was such an interesting conversation regarding the topic of technology, the use of the designer with the computational software. So thank you so much. I'm very eager to share this with people.
Well, thank you, Maria, and congratulations on everything you're doing with the Archiologist. It's fantastic. It's really great, and been following it for a while now, and it's a pleasure to see how it's grown.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, guys, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have an amazing rest of your week. This was episode number 9 with Alvin Huang.
See you all in the next episode. And if you're not following yet, you have to follow The Archaeologist on social media. Do so right now. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, and many more. Also, you should go to our website, thearchaeologist.com. See you on the next episode, guys. Goodbye.